Why does talking politics these days feel less like arguing about budgets or healthcare and more like a deeply personal moral attack on who you are?
Exactly.
If you're like most people, when someone on the opposing side posts something online, that intense, visceral anger you feel,
Hmm.
it's not just intellectual disagreement, it's existential.
It's identity defense.
That's it, that friction, that absolute certainty that the other side is not just wrong, but evil. That's the phenomenon we are diving into today.
And that feeling, that intense personal anger, is the exact core observation that political scientist Lilliana Mason tackles in the book Uncivil Agreement, How Politics Became Our Identity.
A really vital text.
It is, but it's also one that I think demands rigorous inspection.
That's right. So our mission today is a deep dive, not just into what the book says, but a comprehensive critique of how it helps and, well, how it potentially harms our understanding of this intense American polarization.
And what that all means for our democratic ethics. We really believe that some books must be challenged. This critique uses, as appropriate, a step-by-step critical thinking framework that maps claims to evidence. We also apply an intellectual framework from the works of Mortimer J. Adler.
And we even use the Golden Rule and the U.S. preamble to identify ethical asymmetries. Then we wrap it up with a logical analysis and a balanced conclusion.
Right.
And as we navigate this, remember you are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for deeper, more dynamic book critique. It's all aimed at turning reading into rigorous reasoning.
Okay, so let's unpack the argument. We have to start with Mason's central claim, which is crucial for framing everything else.
Lay it out for us.
Contemporary American polarization. It's driven less by genuine disagreements over policy, whether taxes should be 20% or 25%, and more profoundly by social identity.
And this is where it gets really interesting because she introduces the concept of mega-identities.
Yes.
It's not enough anymore to just say you're a Republican or a Democrat.
Yeah.
She shows how your partisan label is now this stacking of almost every other significant identity you hold.
Your racial group, your religious background, where you live.
Your core cultural markers, everything.
Think of it like a series of Venn diagrams that used to be separate: race, religion, party, but they've now collapsed into one perfect circle.
So when all those identities stack up, the political party stops being just a vehicle for policy and starts becoming a proxy for your entire self, for your entire tribe.
Exactly. So when a political opponent criticizes your party, it's no longer an argument about a policy bill.
It's an attack on your heritage, your values, your neighbors. It's fundamentally dehumanizing.
Right. And the dynamic that results from that is a zero-sum struggle. Because the fight is now about identity and culture, not just policy. Democrats and Republicans increasingly view politics as this absolute us versus them battle,
where partisan victory itself becomes the primary objective.
The victory becomes the policy. Precisely. The goal shifts from achieving concrete outcomes that might actually benefit people to simply defeating the enemy. So if we use Adler's perspective on intellectual rigor, we have to ask, what evidence is she relying on?
And she definitely isn't just relying on punditry. I mean, the book's empirical foundation is a real strength.
It really is. It grounds the narrative of toxic partisanship in systematic data. She uses extensive survey data to demonstrate this identity stacking to show how sordid we've all become.
And more than that, she cites classic social psychology experiments.
Like the famous robber's cave paradigm, for example, where you create these artificial groups that quickly develop intense animosity simply because they are groups. It shows how easily this in-group loyalty and out-group hostility can form.
And crucially, the data supports the emotional claim you brought up at the start, that raw anger.
Absolutely. She uses longitudinal measures of what political scientists call affective polarization. It's a bit of jargon, but what it means is simple.
It's the data showing we don't just disagree with the other side's policies.
We actively dislike them as people. We see them as untrustworthy, cold, and fundamentally bad. And that measure is now at historically high levels. The book offers a coherent, evidence-based explanation for why we feel this way.
So if we look at this through the lens of critical reasoning, the book is undeniably powerful because it's so explanatory. It answers that question, what is going on?
The causal story is there. Social sorting leads to intense affective polarization, which then drives political behavior like straight ticket voting. It's coherent.
It is, but that coherence also leads us directly into our first major critical tension, doesn't it? If we apply the standards of rigorous critical thinking, we have to ask, are we sure identity is the only engine driving this?
That's it. You're saying the identity lens, while powerful, risks. Well, it risks monocausality.
The danger of blaming one factor for everything.
That's the risk. What's fascinating here is that by focusing so heavily on identity and social psychology, the analysis can inadvertently narrow its own scope. We risk underemphasizing competing explanations.
And wait, if people are truly polarized by, say, material interests or institutional design, doesn't focusing only on identity kind of let the system and maybe even political leaders off the hook?
That's a key question we have to ask. The identity focus can make all of this polarization feel inevitable, just a function of these big social forces, but we need to zoom out.
So what specifically gets left behind? What factors recede when we only look at identity?
Well, we have to seriously consider material interests first and foremost. For many people, economic inequality isn't an abstract policy debate. It's a lived experience that shapes their political animosity.
And institutional design plays a huge role.
A huge role. Think about how primary election systems reward the extremes, or how asymmetric media ecosystems and social media algorithms are literally designed to incentivize conflict.
So the argument here is that polarization isn't just a psychological thing born of sorted identities, but it's also structurally engineered, shaped by incentives and material conditions.
Precisely. If we apply that critical thinking framework and ask about the book's assumptions, we see the assumption is that identity sorting is the main driver. A fuller analysis has to acknowledge that elite strategy, dark money, economic strain, these are also powerful forces.
It's like a complex stew. Identity might be the intense flavor, but institutions are the pot that cooks it.
That's a great way to put it.
And that shift in focus naturally leads us to the ethical stakes. If mega-identity sorting is the structural problem, what's the moral cost?
This is where the book's findings move beyond just description and become a serious moral critique. The analysis shows how treating political opponents as hated outgroups fundamentally undermines the golden rule.
The rule is simple. Treat others as you wish to be treated. How does that break down in practice?
Well, partisans frequently endorse and rationalize this scorched earth behavior toward the other side. Obstructionism, personal attacks, that they would immediately denounce as unfair if it were directed at their own group.
And because that partisan identity is now fused with fundamental markers like race and religion.
The humiliation of the outgroup can actually feel like an act of moral righteousness.
That is just deeply corrosive to civic life. You're saying the emotional satisfaction of owning the opposition overrides the basic requirement of mutual civic respect.
It does. And if we connect this to the biggest picture possible, the U.S. preamble's commitments to establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, and promote the general welfare, Mason's findings are a blaring ethical alarm bell.
Right. Those are commitments to shared governance, not zero-sum conflict.
Absolutely. When citizens and leaders prioritize partisan victory over shared problem solving, that violates those constitutional aims. It normalizes hostility and erodes compromise, even when data shows that policy agreement actually exists on many issues.
So the cost of identity politics is a lack of governance.
In many ways, yes.
This raises an important question about agency, though. The statistical data is great for seeing these huge patterns, but it can make partisan actors look like, I don't know, passive products of social sorting.
If they're just puppets of these mega-identities, and we have to resist that passivity. A richer intellectual analysis must explicitly ask, who benefits from this polarization? And critically, who could reasonably do otherwise? We have to link structural explanations back to moral responsibility.
So who is making the choice to inflame conflict? The voter, the party leader, the media outlet?
It's all of the above. The focus on structural sorting can sometimes ignore the intentional choices made by leaders and media ecosystems who actively choose to exploit conflict because it boosts their fundraising or their ratings.
And citizens also make choices every day about what media they consume.
Accountability has to exist alongside explanation.
Now, on intellectual fairness, I do appreciate that the book is commendably restrained in its tone. It avoids assigning blame to one party over the other.
That even-handedness is important for its credibility, absolutely. However, we have to flag the common criticism that the language of both sides can potentially obscure real asymmetries.
Asymmetries in what?
In power dynamics, in the nature of political rhetoric used, and crucially, in the actual degree of democratic norm-breaking that occurs.
That's a complex ethical challenge. How do you hold the identity theory, which suggests symmetric animosity, against the observation that political behavior might be asymmetric?
An ethical critique has to acknowledge those differences. Even if the data shows high mutual dislike, that doesn't excuse differences in behavior. It just means we need to supplement the identity perspective with institutional and behavioral analyses to get the full picture.
This book is truly illuminating. It helps you understand why political disagreement feels so existential now, why it hurts so much. And this critique, I think, naturally leads us to reflect on our own behavior.
It really does.
Yeah.
So let's take a mindful moment. When you feel that intense surge of anger, just notice when your political reaction is truly identity defense. Ask yourself sincerely whether the policy stake you're fighting over is actually as large as the emotional surge you feel suggests.
Sometimes the stakes are real, but often the intensity is pure tribal signaling.
And apply that key ethical check. Ask yourself whether you would accept the same treatment, the same level of scorn or character assassination that you're tempted to give your outgroup.
If the answer is no, then you are violating the fundamental premise of civic ethics.
And Mindful Moments, our YouTube channel, exists for exactly this kind of reflection. We offer AI-supported analyses, summaries, critiques, and podcasts designed to slow down our reactivity and build habits of rational, empathetic political thought. We encourage you to check it out.
So after this rigorous examination, what's the final verdict? Let's apply Adler's scale of understanding.
On Adler's scale, Uncivil Agreement absolutely enlarges understanding. It provides an essential conceptual map of how personal identity and party conflict fused into these mega-identities.
It explains why disagreement feels so existential and personal today.
The logic connecting psychological theories, survey evidence, and political behavior is generally strong. It gives us a durable vocabulary, social sorting, mega-identity, affective polarization that is indispensable for discussing modern politics. However, we have to reiterate the main limitations. The normative argument is relatively underdeveloped. It focuses more on what is rather than what should be. And the treatment of remedies is brief. When you describe a problem of this scale, the suggested solutions can feel modest.
So the final verdict is that the book is both intellectually useful and ethically provocative, but you should supplement it with perspectives on institutional constraints, economic inequality, and asymmetric threats to democratic norms.
It's a key piece, not the whole puzzle.
Critically, though, the analysis does point towards some practical civic practices we can adopt.
It does. The logic suggests we need to destack those mega-identities. That means deliberately seeking cross-cutting friendships, supporting institutions that reward compromise rather than extremity,
And cultivating nonpartisan identities, whether professional, local, religious, or hobby-based, that don't neatly map onto our partisan lines.
These steps are about reinforcing the parts of our identities that we share with the outgroup, making them feel less like an enemy and more like complex human beings.
It's a proactive step toward turning polarization from an identity crisis back into a policy debate.
This critique draws on a structured nonfiction critique framework that maps claims to evidence, applies Paul and Elder's critical thinking standards, engages Adler's intellectual ethics, and tests arguments against the Golden Rule and the U.S. preamble.
Click the link on screen for the in-depth book analysis. Subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally about how your own identities shape your politics.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.